Hi, I'm William Flores, and this is Crash Course World History, and today we're talking about the significance of the Cold War in world history. And yes, I am parroting John Green.
Mr. Flores, does this count as plagiarism?
Know me from the past, parodies are considered free use, and I'm simply borrowing this format to convey information I've learned in my world history class in a fun and interesting manner so that when it's shown in class, I won't bore the people to the left and right of me. Anyway, like I was saying, this video is about the Cold War, specifically defining what it is and also how it affected nations across the world for decades to come, which you'll see is a big part of modern history. Now, roll the intro. So before we first get into the significance of the Cold War, we must first analyze what exactly it was, and the key players involved in it. The Cold War began roughly in 1947, but some historians say that might have been a little earlier, around 1945, after the Allied victory against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. But regardless, after World War II, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union soured despite their alliance in the years previously. It was at this point that Russia's influence began expanding into neighboring countries, particularly those in Eastern Europe, which would be formed into the Eastern Bloc. And despite the Red Army liberating governments in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union expanding their influence throughout this entire period of history, no direct war between the US and Soviet Union ever broke out. Now, that's not to say there was no conflict. Instead of tensions being fought on a homeland, both the US and the Soviet Union started off the Cold War with proxy wars, with them supporting certain countries that fit their ideologies between communism and capitalism. This disparity between the two ideologies and the nationalistic ideals would be what drives both the US and the Soviet Union to continue their spheres of influence in many parts of Eurasia and Africa. And if you haven't realized it, the reason why the Cold War is named that way is because, well, it was pretty chill. Terrible pun aside, it was really a make it or break it time for countries and cities as we know them, and the lengths these countries took to be the dominant superpower is commendable. This period had so much conflict and tension that should have resulted in World War III, but somehow it didn't. A few examples of these conflicts include the Vietnam War, the Korean War, the Bay of Pigs invasion, Afghan-Soviet War, the Suez Crisis, the Cuban Revolution, and so much more. It was not only a revolutionary time for new borders and countries to emerge, but it was also a time of uncertainty. You see, capitalism and communism were both widely different in terms of their social, hierarchical, and economic systems. And to analyze that, let's go to my version of the thought bubble. Now, to preface, these economic systems do not always work on their own, and governments are best suited with a mix of these concepts along with some other ones to accommodate their economy. Capitalism mainly included privately owned businesses, a free market system based on supply and demand or the invisible hand, privately owned production, reliant on a healthy middle class, minimal government intervention, and competition facilitating the market. Communism is very different, with common ownership of all resources, an export-based economy, common ownership of production, a classless society, absence of the state, and a lack of competition. In other words, you could think of communism as a bizarro version of capitalism. Thanks, Thought Bubble. And now that we've defined our terms, let's look at some historical examples of conflicts that arose during the Cold War and how they have drastically changed the countries that participated in them. So one of the most well-known conflicts is the Vietnam War, which lasted from November 1st, 1955 to April 30th, 1975. Following French military withdrawal in Indochina, new coalitions formed, such as the Viet Minh, who desired to take control of Vietnam, like some sort of comic Marvel supervillain. The resulting conflict consisted of guerrilla war tactics with Soviet and US support in the north and south, respectively. In the end, the communist north took over once the US withdrew its troops from Vietnam soil in 1973. But what can this conflict and also other similar conflicts like it shows about the Cold War? Well, first off, that these nationalistic ideologies intertwined with communism is what facilitated the need to spread into neighboring countries. If it wasn't for the Viet Minh, they would have never engaged in a conflict like this. Another continuity or key concept I should also mention is the important detail of these coalition groups arising after French withdrawal. You see, imperialism is what provokes those in a country to take on these nationalistic ideals, along with desperation or the need to be independent. An easy way to explain this is that when a country is exploited by another in terms of control, or their economy, or a long-standing societal institutions, that's when the need for change arises, in the form of a country basically saying they want to do whatever the heck they want. Actually, this might be an explanation for why many countries lean towards communism in Afro-Eurasia, as it places heavy emphasis on economic and social freedom without a state. The other example I'm going to use is a little different, but it is an extremely important event in history that cannot be forgotten and can accurately display the extent of a country's control and how communism complements their ideology. What I'm talking about is the Tiananmen Square protests and the subsequent massacre which occurred from April 15th to June 4th, 1989. Beijing students who traveled to foreign countries as part of their university and study began protesting in Tiananmen Square, opposing the Chinese Communist Party and the communist state of the country. Since they were exposed to many European societies westward, they strongly favored freedom of the press, free speech, and most importantly, democracy. The tragedy then occurred, with the People's Liberation Army massacring those who supported these ideologies, with them brutally suppressing information about the incident decades later. And we also must realize how privileged we are as citizens of the United States, because the extreme version of communism is a gateway to totalitarianism. We already have examples of this today. Think of a country like North Korea, who's engaged in total control of their population and indoctrination, that have engaged to paint their leader as a savior, forming a cult of personality. But this is a big reason why the United States focused heavily on containment theory and trying to contain communism to avoid the suppression of thought and free will in the world. Also, I should really mention that both of these ideologies, communism and capitalism, do not work by themselves. Yes, I lean towards capitalism because we live in a capitalist society, but if it was to the extreme left, then we would be at a foundation for complete anarchy. Sure, you can have freedom in the people, but there's a point on the scale where that laws become meaningless and the entire country can become a war zone. If there was no government intervention on supply and demand or the market, then everything would crash immediately. Then on the opposite end, if we have complete control over the people, we would live in a society reminiscent of George Orwell's 1984. When talking about the Cold War, we must keep these things in mind, and the significance of these topics is extremely relevant even today. The Cold War was a war on ideology and the social structure of our established society, and we shouldn't dismiss this period as uneventful, as it was more of a time of uncertainty. Oh, is it time for the open letter? An open letter to George Orwell. But first, let's see what the secret item is for today. Oh, it's a cat poster that says Chairman Mao. Well, I could definitely see the resemblance. Dear George Orwell, I know you were only alive for about 3 years into the Cold War, but I gotta say, you were way ahead of your time. You were an active critic of Stalinization and communist Russia, and you reflected that in many of your books. Animal Farm showcased the communist system on a smaller scale, with each character being an allusion to a key player in the USSR. And 1984 was a showcase of the totalitarian regime that I have been talking about. It's amazing, because you're able to accurately display cult of personality, the extent to limiting free speech, and a restrained world rather than a free one. You have influenced pop culture so much to the point that Big Brother, Thought Police, Newspeak, and so many other terms have practically become synonymous with the state of society, like in China or North Korea. I have so much respect for you and your criticism of these systems, and the only thing that I hate about you is the fact that you ended up letting Napoleon win at the end of Animal Farm. Best wishes, William Flores. So back to the Green Cherub and the Soviets. So another reason why the Cold War was so significant was the fact that it almost resulted in us being completely decimated as a species and possibly becoming vault dwellers like in Fallout. Nuclear weapons were a huge part of geopolitical tensions at the time, and it went so far to the point that children in schools were being taught how to survive in the event of a nuclear strike on the country. The US and the Soviets were essentially playing a global game of tic-tac-toe, with them eventually agreeing that in the end, both of them will lose, no matter what, after the MAD Doctrine, or the Mutually Assured Destruction Doctrine, was adopted. And if you've ever seen the movie War Games, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But both countries for a long time had their hands on the trigger and pointed them right at each other. And a primary example of this is the Cuban Missile Crisis. So after the Cuban Revolution and the formation of the communist Cuban state, Fidel Castro formed an alliance with the USSR and had nuclear long-range missiles armed and ready in Cuba to target the US. The resulting standoff lasted 35 days, with John F. Kennedy meeting with the National Security and reasoning with Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of Communist Russia at the time. The missiles were then eventually removed from Cuba, along with US missiles in Turkey aimed at the Soviet Union per their deal. But what's important about this event is that it almost started a full-scale nuclear war, with each key player and citizen in the country holding their breath as they waited for the eventual nuclear fallout. All this tension was caused by nuclear missiles and was a key component to why Russia and the US had the rivalry in the first place. And in some timeline not too far from ours, the US and Russia would have probably been completely decimated along with numerous other countries. I keep on saying Fallout, but it's the best example I have for this. Even one of the Soviet submarines during the standoff mistakenly believed that war did break out, and they were one button push away from starting the war entirely. And if it wasn't for the naval officer who refused to launch the missile, we would have started World War III. That officer's name is Vasily Arkhipov, and we should all thank him, because if it wasn't for him, I don't think I would be talking right now. And so, if the Cold War might have not have been as interesting as something like World War II, we must realize that it had a potential to be a lot worse than anybody could have ever thought of. Ripples from revolutions and conflicts during the Cold War still exist today in the form of new communist societies and social effects like the Red Scare, which made it so that communist is still a negative buzzword today. Well, maybe not with the people my demographic, maybe those who were actually born in the 80s. But anyway, while the Cold War wasn't that heated in terms of war, it was heated in terms of tension. I'll see you all next class period.